On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million Axis troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, stormed across the Soviet border, shattering the non-aggression pact signed just 2 years earlier. In the halls of the Kremlin, Stalin was paralyzed with disbelief. In the chancelleries of London and Washington, there was a sense of grim hope. The world held its breath. This was not merely another blitzkrieg. It was the beginning of an ideological and racial war of annihilation, a conflict of such unprecedented scale and brutality that it would consume the greater part of the German war machine and ultimately seal the fate of the Third Reich. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was his single greatest strategic blunder, a catastrophic miscalculation born of ideological obsession, economic greed, and a fatal underestimation of a colossal enemy. The roots of this decision lay not in military necessity, but in the core tenets of Hitler's worldview, as articulated in Mein Kampf. He saw the Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, subhumans, and their land, particularly the resource-rich Ukraine, as Germany's necessary Lebensraum, or living space. The 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was always, in Hitler's eyes, a temporary marriage of convenience, a cynical deal to neutralize the Eastern Front while he dealt with France and Britain. By 1940, with France defeated and Britain standing alone, he saw the path clear for his ultimate ambition. He was convinced that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, a rotten structure that would collapse at the first kick of the door. His intelligence, filtered through his own prejudices, suggested the Red Army was leaderless and incompetent after Stalin's purges, its equipment obsolete. He infamously told his generals, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." This profound underestimation of Soviet strength was the first pillar of the disaster. The German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, planned for a short campaign, expecting victory before the onset of winter. They were dangerously wrong. While the initial attacks were devastating, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and advancing hundreds of miles, they failed to achieve their primary objective, the complete destruction of the Red Army. Soviet resistance, though chaotic and costly, was ferocious. Cities like Smolensk, which were supposed to fall easily, became brutal battles of attrition that delayed the German timetable by critical weeks. The vastness of the Soviet territory, the poor infrastructure, and the sheer number of Soviet reserves, which German intelligence had grossly miscalculated, began to stretch the Wehrmacht supply lines to the breaking point. The second catastrophic error was Hitler's personal interference in military operations once the initial momentum slowed. In August 1941, as his armies drove toward Moscow, he made a fateful diversion. Instead of allowing Army Group Center to press on to the Soviet capital, he ordered significant panzer forces to swing south to encircle Soviet forces near Kiev. While the Battle of Kiev was a stunning tactical victory, resulting in the capture of over 600,000 Soviet soldiers, it was a strategic defeat. The delay of over a month gave the Soviets precious time to fortify Moscow and bring fresh Siberian divisions from the east. By the time the German advance on Moscow resumed in October, Operation Typhoon, it was too late. The autumn rains turned the roads into impassable quagmires of mud, known as Rasputitsa, bogging down the German advance. Then, the brutal Russian winter arrived, for which the Germans were completely unprepared. Soldiers froze in their summer uniforms. Tanks and weapons seized up in the sub-zero temperatures. The Soviet winter counteroffensive in December 1941, launched by these fresh, well-equipped Siberian troops, drove the exhausted Germans back from the gates of Moscow. The Blitzkrieg had failed. The war was now one of attrition, a war Germany was not equipped to win. Beyond the military miscalculation, Hitler's political strategy for the occupied territories was a masterpiece of self-destructive folly. Driven by his racial ideology, he rejected any possibility of treating the conquered Soviet peoples as potential allies against Stalin's regime. Instead of presenting themselves as liberators from communism, the Nazis behaved with unimaginable brutality. The Hunger Plan deliberately starved millions of civilians to feed the German army. SS Einsatzgruppen followed the army, systematically murdering Jews, communists, and partisans in mass shootings. The population, which might have initially welcomed the Germans as relief from Stalin's terror, was instead subjected to a reign of terror that galvanized a fierce and widespread partisan war behind the German lines. This guerrilla campaign tied down hundreds of thousands of security troops and wreaked havoc on the already fragile supply lines, forcing the Wehrmacht to fight a war on two fronts within the vastness of Russia. The consequences of Operation Barbarossa were irreversible and fatal for the Third Reich. It transformed a European war into a global conflict, eventually creating the Grand Alliance of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. It committed Germany to a protracted two-front war, a scenario its generals had dreaded since the time of Bismarck. The immense material and human losses suffered in the East. Over 80% of all German military casualties occurred on the Eastern Front, bled the Wehrmacht white. The industrial and demographic might of the Soviet Union, mobilized and supported by Lend-Lease from the West, eventually ground the German army into dust from Stalingrad to Berlin. By breaking the pact with the devil and turning a temporary ally into a mortal, enraged enemy, Hitler had ensured his own destruction. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not just a battle lost. It was the war lost, a decision for which the Third Reich would never and could never recover. 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, on December 11, 1941, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag in Berlin to deliver a speech that would complete the geopolitical constellation of his own defeat. In a move that defied all rational military and political calculation, he formally declared war on the United States of America. This was not an action forced upon him by treaty obligation. The tripartite pact with Japan and Italy was a defensive agreement, activated only if a member was attacked. Japan had been the aggressor at Pearl Harbor, nor was it a response to any immediate, direct American act of war against Germany. It was, instead, a voluntary, almost eager, plunge into a conflict with the one nation on Earth whose industrial capacity and potential military power dwarfed that of the Third Reich. Historian Ian Kershaw would later aptly describe it as the single most decisive step taken by any national leader during the war. It was Hitler's unforced global error, a decision born of ideological rage, strategic miscalculation, and a fatal underestimation of the decadent democracy he so despised. To understand the sheer folly of this declaration, one must first appreciate the strategic position of the United States in December 1941. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had skillfully navigated a path of increasing material support for the Allies through Lend-Lease, but he faced a deeply divided American public and a powerful isolationist movement in Congress. A declaration of war against Germany was politically impossible in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. The American people were united in their fury against Japan, but the war in Europe remained a distant concern for many. Hitler's declaration solved Roosevelt's most difficult political problem overnight. It unified the American public against a second enemy and allowed the president to implement his Europe-first strategy without a bitter domestic political fight. In a single, impulsive act, Hitler had gifted the Allied cause the full, undivided, and furious industrial and military might of the United States. Why would a strategist, even a flawed one, make such a catastrophic choice? The reasons were a toxic blend of emotion, ideology, and flawed strategic reasoning. First and foremost was Hitler's visceral hatred for Roosevelt, whom he saw as the puppet master of a Judaized capitalist system relentlessly working to encircle and destroy Germany. In his Reichstag speech, he railed against Roosevelt's continuous provocations, citing the Lend-Lease aid to Britain and the Soviet Union, the undeclared naval war in the Atlantic where U.S. destroyers were escorting convoys and engaging U-boats, and what he perceived as a long-standing American policy of hostility. He saw the United States as a weak, racially mixed society, riven by internal conflict and incapable of sustained military effort. He shared the common German military view that America's contributions in World War I had been marginal and that its potential in this war was grossly overstated. Flowing from this prejudice was a second, critical miscalculation. Hitler believed Japan to be a formidable and valuable ally. He overestimated Japanese military prowess in the wake of Pearl Harbor and hoped that by tying the United States down in a brutal two-ocean war, Japan would keep American forces distracted in the Pacific, preventing a massive buildup in Europe. He failed to grasp that the American arsenal of democracy was capable of waging and winning a massive two-front war simultaneously. He also fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the Anglo-American alliance, believing that with the United States now fully committed against Japan, Britain would be isolated and forced to sue for peace. The exact opposite occurred. The alliance was strengthened, bound by the shared certainty of ultimate victory. A more cynical, but equally powerful, motive was Hitler's desire to unleash his U-boat fleet. Prior to December 11th, Admiral Karl Donit's U-boats in the Atlantic had been under strict orders to avoid incidents with American vessels, a policy that had hampered their effectiveness. By declaring war, Hitler could authorize a full, unrestricted submarine campaign off the east coast of the United States, what Donitz called Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag. In the short term, this was devastatingly effective, creating a happy time for U-boat commanders as they sank hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping within sight of the American coastline. However, this tactical success masked a strategic disaster. It galvanized American industrial production not just to replace lost ships, but to build a navy of overwhelming power. It also ensured that the full weight of American code-breaking industrial innovation, like the Liberty ships and anti-submarine warfare, will be brought to bear, ultimately leading to the decisive defeat of the U-boat arm in the Battle of the Atlantic by mid-1943. The long-term consequences of Hitler's declaration were both immediate and apocalyptic for the Third Reich. It created the Grand Alliance of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union, a coalition of seemingly incompatible ideologies united by the single goal of destroying Nazi Germany. The industrial output of this alliance was staggering. American factories, safe from bombing, produced more war material than all the Axis powers combined. In 1943 alone, the U.S. built more aircraft than Japan did in the entire war. This flood of equipment, trucks, tanks, aircraft, food, and fuel, would sustain the Soviet war effort and equip the British and American armies for the invasions of North Africa, Italy, and finally, Normandy. The declaration of war on the United States transformed the conflict from a European war, which Germany had a chance of dominating, into a true world war, which it was destined to lose. It guaranteed that the Third Reich would be crushed between the Soviet steamroller in the east and the Anglo-American juggernaut in the west. There would be no negotiated peace, no favorable stalemate. It was a fight to the finish. By bringing the immense resources and determined will of the United States directly to bear against the European Axis, Hitler had signed his own death warrant and that of his regime. It was the ultimate strategic blunder, an unforced error of historic proportions that sealed the fate of the Thousand-Year Reich before it had even reached its fifth year. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as the psychological and military turning point of the Second World War on the Eastern Front. It was a brutal, street-by-street, room-by-room struggle of unprecedented ferocity, where the very rules of warfare seemed suspended. Yet, the true catastrophe for the German Sixth Army was not its entrapment within the city, but the decision that sealed its fate from hundreds of miles away. In the final, desperate days of November 1942, as Soviet pincers closed around the city, a single command from the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, transformed a potential military setback into an unparalleled human and strategic disaster. The order to stand fast and fight to the last man. This was the Haltebefehl, the no-surrender order, a decision driven not by military logic, but by the Führer's unbending pride, his pathological distrust of his generals, and a delusional belief in his own willpower over reality. In sacrificing the Sixth Army, Hitler sacrificed the strategic initiative in the East, and with it, any lingering hope of final victory. The trap, Operation Uranus, sprung by Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov on November 19, 1942, was a masterpiece of planning and deception. While the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was bled white in the urban meat grinder of Stalingrad, Soviet forces massed on the weaker, overextended flanks of the German front, held primarily by ill-equipped Romanian and Italian armies. The Soviet assault shattered these Allied positions, and within 4 days, the pincers met at the town of Kalik, sealing the Sixth Army and part of the Fourth Panzer Army in a vast pocket. The initial reaction from the front was one of shock, but also of clear-sighted military assessment. Both General Paulus and Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commander of the newly formed Army Group Dawn, believed a breakout to the west was the only viable option. The army was low on fuel and ammunition, but it was still a cohesive, powerful force of over 250,000 men. A swift, determined breakout, sacrificing its heavy equipment, stood a reasonable chance of success, saving the core of Germany's finest fighting force. This military logic collided head-on with Hitler's political and psychological obsessions. To him, Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It was a symbol. It bore the name of his archenemy. To retreat from it would be an unthinkable admission of weakness, a blow to his prestige and to the morale of the German people, who had been told the city was all but captured. In a series of fateful conferences, he rejected the pleas for a breakout. He was bolstered by the assurances of the Luftwaffe chief, Hermann Göring, who promised that the trapped army could be supplied by air. This was a fantastical claim. The Sixth Army required a minimum of 750 tons of supplies per day to survive and fight. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet was inadequate, the weather was atrocious, and the Soviet air defense was growing stronger by the day. At best, they delivered a fraction of the necessary supplies. Most days, nothing got through. The airlift was a death sentence disguised as a lifeline. Thus, the order was given: Fortress Stalingrad would hold. Hitler promoted Paulus to Colonel General, implicitly binding him to a fight to the finish. Manstein was ordered to mount a relief operation, but it was a half measure. Operation Winter Storm, launched in mid-December, saw the 4th Panzer Army under General Hoth to within 30 miles of the pocket, but it could not break through the solidified Soviet lines. The order for Paulus to break out and link up with Hoth never came. Hitler insisted Stalingrad be held, and Paulus, a meticulous staff officer rather than a battlefield gambler, obeyed. The window of escape slammed shut. The Sixth Army was now truly doomed, its fate reduced to a slow, agonizing consumption by cold, hunger, and Soviet artillery. The consequences of the Haltebuffel were catastrophic and far-reaching. The human cost was staggering. Of the approximately 250,000 men encircled, barely 90,000 emaciated and frostbitten survivors stumbled into Soviet captivity after the final surrender on February 2, 1943. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. But beyond the tragic loss of life, the strategic loss was irreparable. The Sixth Army was not just any formation. It was an entire field army, the largest in the German order of battle, composed of veteran troops and a corps of superb junior officers and NCOs who were irreplaceable. The loss of their experience would be felt in every subsequent battle. The material cost was equally devastating. The destruction of hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles and guns, and entire stocks of equipment. Psychologically, Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility, both for the Wehrmacht and for the German home front. The news of the surrender, announced by the Nazi regime itself, was a profound shock. It was the first major public defeat, and it signaled that the war was no longer a series of victorious advances, but a desperate struggle for survival. For the Soviet Union, it was the moment of redemption, proof that the Wehrmacht could not only be stopped but annihilated. It cemented the alliance with the West and filled the Red Army with a confidence that would carry it all the way to Berlin. Hitler's no-surrender order at Stalingrad was the ultimate expression of his leadership style, the subordination of military reality to personal will and political symbolism. He sacrificed 250,000 men not for a strategic advantage, but for his own pride and the propaganda value of a name on a map. In doing so, he broke the back of the German offensive power in the east. The initiative passed irrevocably to the Red Army. The long, bloody retreat to the Reich had begun, a direct consequence of a single, prideful decision to let an army die rather than order it to take a single step back. It was not just a battle that was lost at Stalingrad. It was the last vestige of rational strategy in the German High Command. By the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front was a bleeding wound for the German Wehrmacht. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad had been followed by a series of Soviet advances. Yet the German army, though bloodied, remained a formidable fighting force. It was at this pivotal moment that Adolf Hitler chose to stake the last strategic reserves of the Third Reich on a single, massive offensive. The target was the Kursk salient, a massive Soviet bulge jutting 150 kilometers into the German lines. The plan, Operation Citadel, was simple in conception. Twin pincer attacks from the north and south to cut off the bulge and annihilate the Soviet forces within it. What ensued, however, was not the glorious return to blitzkrieg that Hitler envisioned, but a brutal, attritional slugging match that would permanently break the back of Germany's offensive power in the east. The Battle of Kursk was not merely a defeat. It was the deliberate exhaustion of the Reich's final reserves in a battle of Hitler's own choosing. The decision to launch Citadel was fraught with controversy from the start. Senior commanders like General Heinz Guderian, the father of Germany's panzer forces, argued vehemently against it. On no account should we launch an offensive this year, he told Hitler, warning that the new Panther and Tiger tanks were not yet ready in sufficient numbers and that an attack on such an obvious target was foolhardy. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who initially supported the offensive, argued for launching it immediately in the spring to catch the Soviets off balance. Hitler, however, fatally delayed. Obsessed with fielding as many of the new, technologically superior tanks as possible, he postponed the offensive for months. This delay was a gift of incalculable value to the Soviets. It allowed them to use their superior intelligence and reconnaissance to discern the exact German plan of attack and transform the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified position in military history. Under the command of Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, the Soviets constructed a defense in depth unprecedented in scale. They laid over 1 million mines, more than at Stalingrad and Moscow combined, creating dense anti-tank and anti-personnel fields. They dug thousands of miles of trenches, built elaborate anti-tank strongpoints, and massed enormous reserves of their own, including the powerful T-34 tanks, and entire new armies held back for a counteroffensive. This was not to be a battle of maneuver, but a deliberate defensive operation designed to let the Germans batter themselves to pieces against prepared positions. The Soviet strategy was one of calculated, patient attrition. When Operation Citadel finally commenced on July 5, 1943, it immediately ran into a wall of steel and fire. The element of surprise was completely lost. Soviet artillery launched a preemptive barrage on German assembly areas just before the attack was to begin. In the north, General Walter Model's Ninth Army made minimal progress against the deeply echeloned Soviet defenses, gaining only 6 miles in a week of brutal fighting before being halted entirely. The main German hope lay in the southern pincer, led by the elite panzer formations of Army Group South, including the 2 SS Panzer Corps. Here, the fighting reached a new level of intensity in the sprawling tank battles around Prokhorovka. The clash at Prokhorovka on July 12th, often mythologized as the largest tank battle in history, was less a classic engagement of maneuver and more a desperate, close-quarters melee. Hundreds of Soviet T-34s charged headlong into the advancing German Panthers and Tigers. The Soviets suffered horrific losses, but they achieved their strategic goal. They stopped the German spearhead. The SS Panzer Corps, though inflicting disproportionate casualties, was ground down and unable to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The battlefield became a graveyard of smoldering armor. a testament to the ferocity of the Soviet defense. The true death knell for Citadel, however, sounded not at Prokhorovka, but in the Mediterranean. On July 10th, the Allies had invaded Sicily. The threat to Italy and southern Europe forced Hitler's hand. On July 13th, he summoned his commanders to his headquarters and announced the cancellation of Operation Citadel. The need to divert forces, particularly the elite SS panzer divisions, to the new Italian front was presented as the reason, but the truth was that the offensive had already failed. It had been stopped dead by the Soviet defenses without achieving any of its strategic objectives. The consequences of Kursk were immediate and irreversible. For the first time in the war, a major German summer offensive had been halted before it could achieve an operational breakthrough. The strategic initiative passed permanently to the Red Army. More devastating than the loss of territory was the crippling loss of men and material. The Germans lost an estimated 250,000 casualties and over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, losses they could no longer replace. The elite panzer divisions, the spearhead of the Wehrmacht, were bled white. Their experienced crews, the irreplaceable core of Germany's armored might, were gone. Without pause, the Soviets launched their own massive counteroffensives, Operation Kutuzov in the north and Operation Rumyantsev in the south. The exhausted German forces, with their reserves spent at Kursk, had nothing left to stop them. A series of sweeping Soviet advances began that would not stop until they reached the banks of the Dnieper River and beyond. The Battle of Kursk was the final, failed gasp of German offensive power on the Eastern Front. Hitler had gambled his last strategic reserves on a single card, and he had lost. From July 1943 onward, the Wehrmacht was in perpetual, desperate retreat, fighting a war it could no longer win. Kursk was the battle that broke the German army, not by destroying it outright, but by systematically exhausting its last remaining strength, leaving it a hollow force to be swept aside by the relentless Soviet tide. In the final years of the Second World War, as the Third Reich's conventional armies bled on two collapsing fronts, the Nazi leadership unveiled a weapon intended to change the course of the war through terror and technological shock. The V-2 rocket, known officially as the A-4, was a marvel of engineering, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It descended from the edge of space at supersonic speeds, striking without warning and rendering all existing air defenses obsolete. To its creator, Wernher von Braun, and his patron, Armaments Minister Albert Speer, it was a wonder weapon, a wonderwaffe. To Adolf Hitler, it was a weapon of vengeance, a means to punish the nations arrayed against him. But in the cold calculus of total war, the V-2 program represented something far more consequential, a catastrophic misallocation of resources on an almost unimaginable scale. It was a multi-billion Reichsmark project that consumed vast amounts of scarce materials, scientific talent, and industrial capacity, all to produce a weapon that was strategically irrelevant and morally monstrous, ultimately hastening the very collapse it was designed to prevent. The genesis of the V-2 was not born of military necessity, but of a Faustian bargain between the German army and a cadre of visionary rocket enthusiasts. At its head was the brilliant young engineer Wernher von Braun, who saw in the army's funding a path to his dream of space travel. The program, centered at the secret Peenemünde Army Research Center on the Baltic coast, made astonishing technical leaps. The V-2 was a revolutionary achievement, incorporating a liquid-fueled rocket motor, gyroscopic guidance, and supersonic aerodynamics. However, from its inception, it suffered from a fundamental strategic flaw. It was an extraordinarily expensive and complex solution to a tactical problem that could be solved more effectively and cheaply by existing weapons. A single V-2 cost roughly 100,000 Reichsmarks, the equivalent of building 6 of the excellent Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter aircraft. When the strategic situation for Germany deteriorated after 1942, the program's drain on the war economy became critical. The V-2 was a voracious consumer of the Reich's most precious wartime commodities. Its production devoured thousands of tons of steel, aluminum, and copper. Its liquid fuel, a mix of ethanol and liquid oxygen, required vast quantities of potatoes and other agricultural products at a time when the German civilian population was facing severe food shortages. The electrical systems required scarce copper and tungsten. The entire effort was a black hole for resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. The same aluminum used for one V-2 fuselage could have built dozens of anti-aircraft guns to defend German cities from the devastating Allied bombing campaign. The steel could have produced tanks to replace those lost by the thousands on the Eastern Front. The skilled engineers and technicians, a finite and irreplaceable national asset, were sequestered in a high-tech fantasy while the real war was being lost for want of spare parts and reliable equipment for the frontline troops. The human cost of production was another layer of the program's depravity. To conceal the program from Allied bombers and to meet the insatiable demand for labor, production was moved underground to a hellish facility known as the Mittelwerk, built into a mountain near Nordhausen. Here, tens of thousands of slave laborers from the nearby Mittelbau-Dor concentration camp were worked to death under brutal conditions. It is estimated that more people died building the V2, over 20,000 from starvation, disease, and execution, than were killed by its use as a weapon. The V2 was thus unique. It was a weapon that killed twice, first in its manufacture and then in its deployment. Operationally, the V2 was a strategic failure. Launched primarily against London and the vital Belgian port of Antwerp from September 1944, it killed over 9,000 civilians, spreading terror but achieving no meaningful military objective. Unlike a bomber aircraft, it could not be targeted with precision. It was a weapon of random, indiscriminate slaughter, incapable of hitting a specific factory, airfield, or military headquarters. Its psychological impact, while significant, did not break British morale as Hitler had hoped. More importantly, it had no effect on the Allied war effort. The D-Day landings had already succeeded. The Allied air offensive continued unabated, and the Soviet steamroller advanced daily. The V-2 campaign was a spiteful, expensive tantrum, a demonstration of terror that did nothing to slow the Allied military machine. The opportunity cost of the V-2 program was its most damning legacy. The resources poured into von Braun's rockets could have been directed toward war-winning, or at least war-prolonging, technologies. The same scientific genius could have been applied to perfecting the jet engine for the Messerschmitt Me-262, which could have challenged Allied air superiority if deployed in greater numbers and with better reliability. The resources could have been allocated to the production of the simple, deadly Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, which was highly effective in the hands of German infantry. They could have been used to build more of the Type XXI U-boats, the first truly modern submarines, which might have revived the Battle of the Atlantic if introduced earlier. Instead, the Nazi leadership chose to invest in a vengeance weapon, a symbol of technological prowess that was utterly divorced from the strategic realities of a multi-front war of attrition. The V-2 program stands as a stark monument to the irrationality and moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime. It was a product of a leadership that valued spectacle over substance, revenge over reason, and technological vanity over practical military need. In diverting a significant portion of its dwindling industrial and scientific capital into this colossal project, the Third Reich actively sabotaged its own ability to wage effective defense. The V-2 did not change the fate of World War II. It merely illustrated the profound misjudgment of the man who commanded it. It was the ultimate white elephant, a terrifying and brilliant dead end that consumed the lives of its builders and the strength of a nation, all for the privilege of a few final, futile blows against an enemy that had already won. By December 1944, the strategic situation for Nazi Germany was dire. In the east, the Red Army had shattered Army Group Center and stood on the borders of East Prussia. In the west, the Anglo-American armies, though temporarily stalled after the Operation Market Garden setback and fierce fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, were marshaling their overwhelming strength for a final push into the German heartland. The Reich was being squeezed in a vice of its own making. It was at this moment of impending collapse that Adolf Hitler chose to gamble everything on one last, desperate throw of the dice. Conceived in total secrecy and launched against the near-unanimous advice of his generals, the Ardennes Offensive, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, was not a coherent military operation designed to achieve a sustainable strategic goal. It was a massive, all-or-nothing operational binge, a final convulsion that burned the Reich's last reserves of fuel, manpower, and armored vehicles, ensuring there would be nothing left to defend the fatherland in the war's final, inevitable act. The plan, personally dictated by Hitler from his isolated Western Front headquarters, the Adlerhorst, Eagle's Nest, was audacious to the point of fantasy. It called for a repeat of the stunningly successful 1940 campaign, striking through the same densely forested and lightly defended Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. The goal, however, was far more ambitious and utterly divorced from reality. Three armies, the 6th Panzer Army under SS General Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army under General Otto von Manschenfeld, and the 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger, would punch a hole in the American lines. They would race for the Meuse River, then swing north to capture the critical Allied port of Antwerp. Hitler's objective was to split the British and American armies, recapture the initiative in the West, and force the Western Allies to sue for a separate peace, thereby allowing Germany to concentrate its entire might against the Soviet Union. The flaws in this plan were fundamental and numerous. First, the German army of 1944 was a pale shadow of the 1940 Wehrmacht. The units assembled for the offensive were a mix of elite, refitted SS panzer divisions and a larger number of understrength, poorly equipped Volksgrenadier divisions filled with inexperienced conscripts. While the panzer divisions were equipped with the formidable King Tiger and Panther tanks, the army as a whole lacked the mobile infantry, the air support, and most critically, the fuel required for such a deep, sustained operation. The entire plan was predicated on the capture of Allied fuel depots, particularly at Stavelot and Bastogne, as the German fuel reserves were only sufficient for the initial breakthrough. This was not a strategy. It was a hope, a prayer that the enemy would conveniently provide the means for their own destruction. Second, Hitler fatally underestimated his enemy. He dismissed the American soldier as incapable of withstanding a determined assault, a product of his own racial ideology. He believed the Allied coalition was fragile and that a sharp, humiliating defeat would cause it to splinter. He failed to grasp the immense industrial and moral resilience of the United States or the stubborn professionalism of its army. The initial surprise achieved on the foggy morning of December 16th was indeed shocking, and the ferocity of the assault caused a massive bulge in the Allied lines. But the American response, from the pockets of isolated resistance to the rapid redeployment of reserves, was not one of panic, but of determined, if chaotic, defiance. The stands made by units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne and the 7th Armored at St. Vith became epicenters of American resolve, creating critical traffic jams and buying precious time for Generals Eisenhower and Patton to orchestrate a counterattack. The offensive's failure was sealed by a combination of American grit and the reemergence of Allied air power. After a week of bad weather that had grounded the formidable Allied tactical air forces, the skies cleared on December 23rd. From that point on, the roads leading to the front became shooting galleries for American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons. German panzers, trucks, and supply columns were annihilated from the air. The already tenuous supply lines were completely severed. The spearheads of the 5th Panzer Army, which had come within sight of the Meuse River at Celles, were cut off and destroyed. The 6th Panzer Army's brutal drive was halted short of its objectives, its elite divisions chewed up in futile assaults. The consequences of the failed offensive were apocalyptic for the German war effort. The human and material losses were staggering and irreplaceable. The Wehrmacht suffered between 80,000 and 100,000 casualties, including the loss of its best remaining troops. The armored losses were even more catastrophic. Germany lost between 600 and 800 tanks and assault guns, the core of its remaining panzer force. These were the very formations that were desperately needed to defend the Rhine and the Oder rivers. They had been squandered in a hopeless offensive in the West. Most critically, the Ardennes Offensive consumed the Reich's last strategic reserves of fuel and ammunition. The carefully hoarded stocks, intended for a protracted defense of the homeland, were burned up in a matter of weeks in the frozen forests of Belgium. When the Soviets launched their massive Vistula-Oder offensive on January 12, 1945, just days after the Bulge had been contained, the Eastern Front was denuded of mobile reserves. There were no panzer divisions left to transfer east to meet the onslaught. The road to Berlin was left virtually undefended. The Ardennes Offensive was Hitler's final, definitive strategic mistake. It was a battle that should never have been fought, a gamble that guaranteed a swifter and more total defeat. By committing his last operational reserves to a desperate offensive in the West, he ensured that the defense of Germany itself would be hollow. He had burned the Reich's final fuel not in a last stand at the Rhine, but in a reckless adventure that left the gates to the fatherland swinging open. The offensive did not delay the end of the war. It hastened it, proving that the greatest threat to the survival of the Third Reich in its final months was the strategic insanity of its own Führer.